The road into Ash Hollow wound like a scar through the plain, a thin, pale ribbon of dust that caught the evening sun and turned it to smoke. The wind had a dry bite to it, lifting grit from the ruts where wagon wheels had ground the earth thin. It carried the smell of old ash and sage, of something tired and long since burned out. At the end of that road came the gallows cart, its wheels moaning with every turn. 2 horses pulled the weight of one condemned soul, and even they seemed to know the burden of it. In the cart sat Eleanor Finch, her hands bound in front of her, wrists rubbed raw where the rope had bitten through skin. She sat straight, jaw set, eyes fixed, not on the town ahead, but on the horizon behind, the line where the plains met the dying light. Ash Hollow was a place that had once mattered. The old sign still swung from a post by the livery, founded 1852. But the paint had faded, and the letters peeled away like memory itself. There was a saloon with one working shutter, a church bell that no longer rang, and a small crowd already gathering around the square. The noose swayed in the breeze, and the boards beneath it groaned like a waiting conscience. The deputy climbed down from the cart, spitting dust from his teeth. "Eleanor Finch," he called out, his voice thin and proud. "Condemned by Judge Horace Mayfield for the murder of Sheriff Doolin of Ash Hollow. Sentence, hanging by the neck until dead, to be carried out before sundown." No one spoke. The crowd watched, eyes hard and quiet, men with calloused hands, women with kerchiefs pulled tight against the wind. Some had known her husband once. Some had wanted her land. Most simply wanted something to look at besides the long, empty day. Eleanor didn't plead. She didn't ask for mercy. The skin beneath her eyes was pale from sleeplessness, but her back stayed straight. She'd lived long enough to know that silence sometimes spoke louder than begging. Among the faces, one man stood apart, broad-shouldered, coat dark with trail dust, hat low over his eyes. He leaned against a hitching post, the wind tugging at the worn hem of his duster. Calder Hayes. Some knew the name, though most thought it belonged to a ghost from the border wars, the gunslinger who'd fought for both sides, depending on who paid him in coin or whiskey. He had ridden into town that morning, drawn not by rumor but by the notice nailed crooked to a telegraph pole in Cobalt Springs. It had a name on it, Eleanor Finch, widow. The word widow had stopped him longer than he cared to admit. He remembered her husband, Finch, a decent man who'd shared a fire with him once, before the world burned itself to ruin. Now here was the man's wife, bound for the rope. The deputy climbed the platform and began to read the words again for good measure, but Calder barely heard. He watched Eleanor, the way her eyes didn't dart or waver, the way her mouth stayed still even as the wind pushed her hair into her face. There was defiance there, yes, but also something emptier. She'd already died once, somewhere no one could see. He stepped forward when the deputy asked for last words. "Hold a moment," he said, voice low but carrying. The deputy turned. "You got business here, mister?" Calder's gaze swept the crowd. "I do. By the laws of the frontier territories, Statute 52, a condemned woman may be claimed in marriage before sentence, provided a witness stands to affirm." A murmur rippled through the crowd like stirred grass. Judge Mayfield, fat and red-faced from whiskey, squinted down from his chair. "You're a fool, stranger. That statute ain't been used since the war." Calder nodded slightly. "Then it's due for use again." The judge leaned forward. "You mean to take her as your wife?" "I do." Eleanor turned her head at that, not startled, not hopeful, simply measuring him. She'd seen many men in her life claim noble causes for ugly reasons. But this one's voice held no boast, no bargain. Just weariness. The deputy laughed under his breath. "And what's your name, mister?" "Calder Hayes." That name fell like a stone into a still pond. Even the wind seemed to pause. Somewhere, someone whispered, "The Black Rider." Another muttered, "He's dead." Calder ignored them. He looked at Eleanor. "If you'll have it, ma'am, I can keep you from the rope. That's all I can promise." For a long heartbeat, she said nothing. The crowd waited for her to refuse, to spit, to curse the farce of it. But instead, she met his gaze and gave the smallest nod. The judge swore under his breath. You're both mad." By the law of that dying county, a witness was found, a trembling priest pulled from the saloon, and the words were spoken there in the dust beneath the gallows. No vows of love, no promises of forever. Only the formalities of two lost souls finding shelter in a technicality. When it was done, the judge waved them off. "Take her, and get the hell out before nightfall." Calder cut the ropes from her wrists. The skin was raw beneath, marked by the shape of captivity. For the first time, her shoulders lowered. She took one deep breath and looked at the sky, the sun already sinking toward the west, red and unrelenting. The crowd parted as they walked through, silent, except for the creak of Calder's spurs and the faint clink of her irons still hanging loose around her ankles. Children watched from doorways. Old men spat. Women turned their faces away. They reached his horse, a broad, scarred bay gelding with one ear missing, and he helped her up without a word. She hesitated only once, glancing back at the gallows where the rope swung lonely in the wind. Then they rode out of Ash Hollow, the town shrinking behind them, the sky deepening to the color of dying embers. Neither spoke. The sound of hooves against hard earth was steady, patient, final. The prairie opened before them, wide and endless. The air cooled, carrying the scent of rain far off. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor closed her eyes. Behind her, Calder rode silent, the brim of his hat low, his thoughts darker than the land ahead. He didn't ride for redemption. He rode because something in her name had reminded him of the man he might have been. Once, before mercy became too costly and hope too small, and as the light faded, Ash Hollow returned to its stillness. A place that had seen justice done, or maybe just postponed, far on the horizon. The two figures rode west, their shadows long and uncertain, swallowed by the coming dark. They rode west into the low country where the land broke into scattered bluffs and lonely cottonwoods. The sun had long since vanished, leaving behind a soft gray that clung to the ridges like breath. Neither of them spoke. The horses' hooves struck rhythm on the hardpan, a hollow sound that carried for miles. Dust clung to Eleanor's hair and skirt, mixing with the faint scent of iron from the rope burns on her wrists. The wind came down from the hills, cold and clear. Calder rode ahead, his posture upright but tired. From time to time he glanced back to see if she was still there. She always was, her silhouette upright, hands steady on the reins. He didn't ask if she was afraid. She didn't ask where he was taking her. Silence, for now, served them both better than words. They crossed a dry creek bed and climbed toward a ridge of limestone. At the top, the land opened to a small valley. Sparse grass, one dying oak, and a structure leaning against the wind. Calder's homestead. It wasn't much to look at. A barn with half its roof missing, a porch sagging under the weight of years, and one stubborn lamp glowing faintly through a window. He dismounted, tied his horse, and waited for her to follow. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the porch, eyeing the broken boards, the cracked window panes, the faint trace of smoke curling from the chimney. "You live here alone?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Calder nodded. "For some time now." Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the dry sweetness of old wood. The table bore the scars of use, knife marks, candle burns, a single chipped cup beside a half-empty pot. Rain had warped the ceiling beams. The place smelled of solitude. He set down his hat, filled a tin mug from the pot on the stove, and offered it to her. "Coffee." She stared at it for a moment, then shook her head. "Not tonight." He didn't press. He took the cup himself, drank, and sat near the window. Outside, the horses shifted in the corral, the creak of leather and the low murmur of night sounds filling the silence between them. Eleanor stood near the doorway, arms crossed over her chest as if to hold herself together. She had imagined many ends for herself, the gallows, the desert, a shallow grave, but not this. Not a quiet room, and a man who spoke less than prayer. When she finally sat, she chose the far side of the room, near the cold hearth. She drew her shawl tighter and stared at the fireless stones until her eyes blurred. Calder spoke at last. "You can take the bed. I'll keep to the chair." She looked up, surprised by the gentleness of his tone. "I've slept on worse." "I reckon we both have." He stood, lit a lantern, and hung it on the nail beside the door. The light was thin but warm, painting his face in lines of gold and shadow. For the first time, she saw the man clearly. Not the gunslinger from rumor, but someone older, carved down to essentials. The grey in his beard, the small scar near his jaw, the wear of too many miles. When he turned to leave the room, she caught herself wanting to speak, to ask why he'd done what he had in Ash Hollow. But the question felt too heavy, too soon. So she said nothing, and he said nothing back. She lay down later, though sleep came slow. Outside, the wind tapped against the window like a memory trying to get in. When she finally drifted off, it was not peace that came, but the faces of her past. The courtroom, lit too bright. The judge's hammer. The neighbors staring, whispering. The empty benches where her friends once sat. She saw herself standing alone as they read the sentence. The word murderess still rang in her skull like a bell. She woke before dawn, heart racing, breath sharp. The lamp still burned low, and Calder sat by the window, awake. He hadn't slept at all. He watched the night thinning into gray, the first light catching on his revolver where it rested beside him. "You dream loud," he said softly. Eleanor rubbed her eyes. "I've had practice." He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth eased. He stood, went to the stove, and poured her coffee without asking this time. She took it, grateful for the warmth even if the taste was bitter. The silence that followed was easier, less brittle. When morning came fully, Calder stepped outside to tend the horses. Eleanor followed to the porch, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The air smelled of wet sage and distant rain. A thin mist hung low in the valley. She watched him work, the careful way his hands moved as he brushed the horse's flank, checked the hooves, tightened the straps. His fingers were rough, scarred, and yet there was patience in them, as if he'd learned to handle fragile things too late in life. He looked up once and caught her watching. For a second, neither looked away. Then he went back to his work, and she turned to the horizon, pretending interest in the clouds. Inside, she began tidying without thinking. Folded the blanket he'd left on the chair, wiped the dust from the table, found a small tin bowl and filled it with water from the pump outside, setting it near the window. The simple act of order steadied her. When Calder came in again, he noticed but said nothing. He only nodded once, as if acknowledging that she was still trying, and that trying in itself mattered. By noon, the light was bright and clean through the window. She braided her hair again, uneven but tight, and tied it with a strip of torn cloth. Calder noticed, though he pretended not to. He found himself thinking that her defiance had a kind of beauty to it, quiet and sharp as flint. He fetched his rifle from the rack and checked the sights, a habit without purpose. "You plan to stay a while?" he asked, almost as if it didn't matter. She met his gaze. "I don't know where else to go." He nodded once. "That's reason enough." They said nothing more after that. The afternoon drifted by in the hush of wind and creaking boards. 2 lives emptied by time and misfortune, beginning to fill again in the smallest, most fragile way, with presence, with silence, with something close to understanding. Outside, a hawk circled above the valley. Below, the rosebush by the well shivered in the breeze, a bloom struggling to open in the dry wind. Neither of them noticed it then, but the thaw had already begun. The first drops came slow, tapping like hesitant fingers against the roof. Then the wind shifted, and the plains opened to the rain. It fell in sheets, hard and sudden, swallowing the horizon in a gray blur. The horses in the corral stamped and tossed their heads. The air smelled of wet earth and lightning. Calder stood on the porch, hat low, watching the line of storm clouds crawl from the west. The sky was the color of old iron. He could feel the change in his bones, that deep ache the old soldiers spoke of before weather or trouble. Behind him, Eleanor stacked kindling near the hearth, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The cabin felt smaller with the sound of the rain pressing in, the rhythm relentless, as if the whole world had turned to water. Calder turned to speak. But before he could, a shadow moved through the curtain of rain, a rider, barely visible at first, then emerging slow from the storm. A horse dark with mud, a figure slumped low in the saddle. He stepped off the porch, rifle in hand. When the rider drew close, he called out, "Who goes?" The figure straightened, lifted a badge glinting wet in the gloom. "Deputy Moran, out of Cobalt County." Calder lowered the rifle slightly but didn't relax. "You're a long way from Cobalt." The young man dismounted, rainwater pouring from his hat brim. He couldn't have been more than 25, his face too clean for the wild country. "Got word of a woman saved from the rope by marriage claim," he said. "Name of Eleanor Finch." Eleanor stepped into the doorway, her shawl pulled close. The deputy's eyes found her at once. His jaw tightened. "I was sent to verify that claim," he said, "and see that justice wasn't—" He paused, glancing between them. "Interfered with." Calder gestured toward the cabin. "Storm will drown you before your questions do. Come in." Inside, the wind clawed at the shutters. The room glowed dim with lamplight and fire. Water dripped from the deputy's coat onto the wooden floor, each drop loud in the hush. Eleanor sat near the fire, her posture straight. Calder poured 3 cups of coffee and handed one to Moran, who took it with suspicion. "You live out here alone?" the deputy asked. "Mostly," Calder said. "And her?" "She does now." The deputy's eyes shifted to Eleanor. "You were sentenced to hang. You understand what that means, ma'am? That law don't fade just because some man took pity." Her hands rested on her lap, calm but pale. "I understand more than most about what law means," he frowned. "You killed a sheriff." "I did. Why?" Eleanor's eyes lifted to meet his. "Because he came for what wasn't his. My land, my home, my body if I'd let him. So I didn't." Her voice didn't tremble. The words hung in the smoky air like truth that needed no defense. The deputy shifted, uncomfortable. He looked to Calder for some rebuttal, but none came. The older man only stirred the fire, his face unreadable in the orange light. "Law's still law," Moran said quietly, as if reminding himself. Calder looked up. "Maybe, but sometimes it comes riding on the wrong horse." Lightning split the sky outside, white and searing. The crack of thunder followed hard after, shaking the rafters. Rain hammered the roof in a steady roar. For a long while, the 3 of them said nothing. The fire popped and hissed. The wind found every crack in the wall. The deputy sat near the door, one hand near his holster, though whether from duty or unease, even he didn't seem sure. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the window, where water ran down the glass like melting silver. "How old are you, deputy?" she asked softly. 25, he said. "I had a son once," she murmured. "He'd have been about your age now." The words caught Calder's attention, but he said nothing. It was the first time she had spoken of anything before Ash Hollow. The deputy swallowed. "I didn't mean no harm, ma'am. I just got to make sure the books stay straight." "Books," she said, almost to herself. "Funny thing about books. They keep names, not faces." The wind rose again, fierce and sudden. The shutters banged open with a crash. Calder was on his feet at once, crossing the room to secure them. But before he could, a sharp crack sounded from above, a branch, heavy and wet, tearing loose from the old oak and smashing through the roof. The impact threw dust and splinters into the air. Eleanor gasped as part of the beam came down near her chair. Calder lunged without thinking, dragging her back just as another piece of timber fell where she'd been sitting. Moran froze for a heartbeat, hand on his pistol, then lowered it, staring at the 2 of them in the flickering light. Calder's arm was around her shoulders, his body between her and the wreckage. Rain poured through the gap above, the wind howling like a living thing. "You all right?" Calder asked. Eleanor nodded faintly, her breath quick. "I'm fine." He looked at her a long moment, then rose to brace the broken beam with his shoulder until Moran hurried to help. Together they pushed the branch aside and nailed a tarp across the open gap. When it was done, they stood dripping, breathing hard, faces streaked with sweat and soot. The storm still raged, but the worst of it had passed. Eleanor went to the fire, added fresh wood, and the room began to warm again. The deputy sat heavily near the door, staring at Calder and the woman he'd meant to judge. After a long silence, Moran spoke. "You didn't flinch," he said to Calder. "When it came down, you moved like you'd done it before." Calder shrugged. "You see enough people die, you learn which way to move. And her?" Moran nodded toward Eleanor. "You'd risk yourself for her?" Calder met his eyes. "I already did." The young deputy looked between them. the tension in his jaw easing. Outside, the thunder began to fade, distant now. He rubbed his temples, weary. "I'll write my report," he said finally. "Say the marriage stands. The county don't need another mess to clean." Calder inclined his head. "That'll do." Moran stood, pulling on his soaked coat. "For what it's worth, ma'am," he said to Eleanor, "I don't think you were wrong." She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Then maybe you'll live long enough to know what that costs." He nodded once, as if taking her words like a brand on the conscience, then stepped out into the wet dawn. Calder watched from the doorway as the deputy rode away through the thinning mist. The rain soft now, silver against the grass. Inside, Eleanor knelt near the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she straightened the chair he had pulled her from. Calder turned back to her. "You sure you're unhurt?" She gave a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You can't break what's already been dropped." For the first time, he almost smiled back. Almost. The storm rolled east, leaving only dripping eaves and the faint smell of cedar smoke. The two of them stood in its quiet ruin, the distance between them smaller now, not bridged by words, but by survival. And in that silence, the cabin seemed to breathe again. The storm passed, but its ghost lingered in the sky, thin streaks of cloud drifting low, the air smelling of damp cedar and smoke. For the first time in months, the land around Calder's homestead looked soft again, touched by green. Water pooled in the wagon ruts. Birds returned to the fence posts, wary but singing all the same. Days stretched slow, almost gentle, though the quiet between them was heavy as unspoken things. Calder rose before dawn, the rhythm of work his only prayer. He fixed what winter had broken, rails, hinges, the north fence, moving like a man trying to rebuild something more than wood and wire. Eleanor kept to the cabin. She swept the porch, aired out the bedding, patched his shirts where the seams had split. Sometimes she hummed under her breath, a tune without name or joy, something old and threadbare. In the yard, by the well, she found a rose bush still clinging to life. Its stalks were brittle, its petals long gone, but when she cut back the dead growth, she found a single red bud pushing through. "Reckon it's a fool thing to bloom out here," Calder said one evening, leaning against the post as she worked. "Maybe," she said, brushing soil from her palms. "But it's doing it anyway." He didn't answer, but she caught the flicker of something like respect in his eyes before he turned away. That was how they lived, speaking little, moving careful around each other, as though words might wake what both tried to bury. At night, the wind moaned through the eaves and the fire crackled in the hearth. She slept light, dreams circling back to the gallows, to the creak of the rope and the crowd's hush before the drop. Sometimes she woke with her hands at her throat, breath quick, eyes wet. Calder never spoke of it, but more than once, she found fresh logs on the fire before dawn, proof he'd been awake, keeping watch. 3 days after the storm, a wagon appeared on the ridge road. Dust trailed it like a veil. Eleanor saw it first, her body tensing before her mind caught up. A woman climbed down, tall, raw-boned, her hair bound tight in a gray braid. Mrs. Reddin, the neighbor from 2 miles east. Her husband had died last winter, but her eyes were sharp as ever, small and mean with curiosity. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Reddin said, surveying the yard. "Didn't think I'd see another woman out here." "Folks been talking, you know." Eleanor steadied her voice. "People do that when they've got nothing else." The older woman smiled thinly. "They say you were meant to hang." "That true?" Eleanor's hands tightened on the broom. "You ask that like it's a curiosity," Mrs. Reddin shrugged. "Out here, curiosity's the only thing keeps you breathing." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They're calling you the hangman's bride. That's what the preacher said last Sunday." Eleanor didn't flinch, though the words sliced clean. "Then they should pray harder," Mrs. Reddin sniffed. "You watch yourself. Lawmen don't forget names like yours." She turned, calling back over her shoulder. "You too, Calder. She'll bring the noose back to your door if you ain't careful." Calder, who'd been at the corral, didn't respond. He just waited until the wagon rolled away and the dust settled back into silence. That evening, Eleanor sat by the window, hands still, the broom forgotten. The sun was low, its light slanting gold through the panes. She could see her reflection faint in the glass. A face leaner than she remembered, older maybe. The faint rope marks like pale threads beneath her collar. Calder came in from outside, brushing dust from his sleeves. He stopped when he saw her sitting there. Without a word, he poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the windowsill beside her. She didn't look at him. "She called me the hangman's bride," I heard. "Is that what you think too?" He leaned against the wall, the floor creaking under his weight. "Don't matter what I think. It does," she said quietly. "You're the one who took me down from that rope." He didn't answer at first. The only sound was the tick of the cooling stove and the faint rustle of the wind through the boards. Finally, he said, "You want to know why I did it?" She turned toward him. "Yes." He stared into the fire, his face drawn with shadow. "Because no one did for me." The words hung there, bare and final. Eleanor waited, but he didn't explain. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe it didn't need explaining. She looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, the old scars on his knuckles, the way he stood like a man still bracing against a blow. For the first time since Ash Hollow, she felt something like understanding. Not pity, not forgiveness, just the quiet recognition of another ruined soul still trying to stand. She lifted the cup and took a sip. It was bitter, strong, grounding. "Then I suppose we're both still waiting on someone," she said. He met her eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe this is what comes after waiting." The fire cracked softly between them. Later, when the night settled thick and the crickets began their slow song, Calder sat outside whittling at a piece of pine. The stars were faint, the moon a thin white scar. Through the window he could see her silhouette at the table, mending one of his shirts. Her head bent to the work, her hands moving steady. He wondered what it cost her, to keep living in a place that had tried to bury her. To speak again after the world had already pronounced her dead. When he came back in, she'd fallen asleep in the chair, needle still in hand. He took it gently, set it aside, and draped his coat over her shoulders. For a long moment he watched her breathe, slow and even, her face softened by the firelight. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Ain't no hangman's bride here." She stirred but didn't wake. Outside the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of roses, and for the first time in a long while, Calder let himself believe that something broken might still learn to hold. The days after Mrs. Reddin's visit passed uneasily. The air felt heavier, the light sharper somehow, as if the land itself held its breath. Calder sensed it first, the quiet wrongness in the wind, the faint metallic echo that rides before trouble. By the fourth morning, even the horses grew restless, shifting and snorting in the paddock. Just before dusk, he saw them. 4 riders cresting the ridge, shadows against the bruised horizon. They moved with purpose, rifles glinting in the last of the sun. Calder's stomach turned cold. "Stay inside," he told Eleanor, his voice low, already reaching for the Winchester propped by the door. She looked past him, toward the dust rising on the road. "Who are they?" "Men from Ash Hollow," he said. "The sheriff's kin. Maybe worse." By the time the riders reached the yard, the light had gone. The sky glowed faint and sullen, and the only sound was the jingle of bridles, the creak of saddle leather. The man in front swung down first, broad-shouldered, thick-bearded, his eyes pale and bitter. "You Calder Hayes?" he asked. "I am. You're harboring a killer." He jerked his chin toward the cabin door. "Name's Eleanor Finch. She shot Sheriff Dow clean through the chest. We come to take her back." Calder stood easy, though his grip on the rifle was tight. "She's under my protection," the man spat into the dust. "You can't marry sin, Hayes. You can't hide it, neither." A murmur rippled through the others, low laughter, cruel. One of them struck a match and lit a twist of tobacco. The flame flickered in the dark like an omen. Eleanor stepped into the doorway before Calder could stop her. She wasn't armed. Her hair hung loose, her shawl drawn close against the wind. The sight of her made the men shift, uncertain, as though the condemned woman had stepped from a grave. "You think this about justice," she said quietly. "It's not. It's about pride," the leader's jaw tightened. Heard you was a fine talker in court, too. Didn't save you then. Won't now. Calder moved slightly forward, the barrel of his rifle rising to meet their eyes.
Leave now, and you'll leave whole. For a long moment, no one moved.
The wind moaned through the dry grass. The leader's hand hovered near his pistol, the air between them brittle as glass. Then he barked a laugh. You gone soft, Hayes. Used to be you had a name folks feared. Names fade, Calder said. Graves don't. The leader's smirk faltered. He drew his gun halfway, but before he could level it, Eleanor's voice cut through the dark. You've taken enough from this land, she said. Her voice shook, but she did not waver. My husband, my home. The little piece of mercy left to me. If you're here to burn what's left, then do it. But know you'll bury yourselves in the same fire. The men hesitated. The leader's eyes flicked to Calder, then to the rose bush by the well, its single red bloom trembling in the wind. Last chance, Calder said softly. Turn back. The leader's answer was the snap of his pistol rising. A single shot split the air, thunder after silence. One of the riders cried out, clutching his arm as his gun spun into the dirt. The others froze, the horses stamping and tossing their heads. Smoke coiled from Calder's rifle. He hadn't aimed to kill. The message was enough. No one spoke. The wounded man groaned. The leader looked down at him, then up at Calder. Saw no fear there, only the steady calm of a man done running. Mount up, he said finally, his voice rough. Ain't worth the blood. They backed away, muttering, the sound of their hooves fading into the gathering dark. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and rain, faint, distant, maybe a storm coming again. When they were gone, Calder lowered the rifle. His hands trembled now, the adrenaline draining like a fever. Eleanor still stood in the doorway, the lamplight catching the faint silver lines at her throat. You shouldn't have done that, she said softly. Would you rather I didn't? She shook her head, eyes bright with something he couldn't name. No, but I'd rather it hadn't come to that at all. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. Out here it always comes to that. She stepped closer. Does it have to? Her question lingered. The firelight flickered behind her, painting her face in soft gold and shadow. For the first time he saw her not as the woman who'd been condemned, but as someone still alive, still fighting to believe that life meant more than survival. They buried the blood that night, a shallow grave behind the corral where the grass grew thin. No words were spoken. The earth accepted what it always did, sweat, fear, and silence. Afterward, Calder sat by the fire, the rifle laid across his knees. Eleanor brewed coffee, her hand steady now. She poured 2 cups and handed him one. Thank you, she said simply. He nodded, eyes on the flames. Wasn't for thanks, I know, she said. That's why it matters. The wind rose again outside, rustling through the rose bush. Its stem bent under the gust but did not break. The single bloom shivered, catching the firelight like a coal in the dark. Eleanor watched it through the window. Funny thing, she murmured. How it keeps standing. Calder followed her gaze. Tough roots. Maybe just stubborn, he almost smiled. Ain't much difference. For a long time they sat without speaking, listening to the wind and the slow crackle of the fire. Between them hung the scent of smoke and coffee, the heavy peace that follows after choosing not to kill more than you had to. Outside, the land settled again. The stars blinked open over the plains. The rose bush bowed under the night air, still living, still red, and though neither said it aloud, both understood. Something sacred had taken root. Not love yet, not forgiveness, but the first fragile shape of both. The spring rains came and went, softening the edges of the land. Grass pushed through the scars of fire, and the creek below the ridge began to run clear again. The earth smelled of renewal, but the quiet that followed was not peace. It was the waiting kind, heavy with what might still come. Word of the shooting traveled slow but sure, carried by riders, by rumor, by the kind of talk that clings to the walls of saloons. Calder knew it wouldn't be long before someone from the county seat came asking questions. 3 weeks passed before they arrived. 2 lawmen in dust-stained coats, their badges dulled by the road. They came near sundown, their horses spent, eyes cautious as they took in the homestead, the mended porch, the smoke curling from the chimney, the woman standing in the doorway. "Calder Hayes," the older one said, dismounting. "We've had word of a shooting out this way, and of a woman who was meant to hang," Calder nodded once. "You heard right." The younger deputy shifted in his saddle, hand brushing the grip of his revolver. "That woman's still under sentence." "Not anymore," Calder said evenly. "She's under my roof and by law, my wife." The older man studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're claiming her under Article 12? "That's the one." The deputy frowned. "Ain't been invoked in years." "Still stands," Calder said. The silence that followed was long and taut. Eleanor stepped out then, shawl drawn close, her face calm. The lawmen turned to her, maybe expecting shame or fear. Instead, they found only steadiness. "I shot a man," she said quietly. "He came to take my land after my husband died. There were no witnesses willing to speak truth for me then. But I won't hide it now." The older man's gaze flicked between them. The woman who'd stood at the gallows, and the gunslinger who'd pulled her back from its shadow. And the men who came here 3 weeks ago. "One's nursing a wound," Calder said. "The others rode home breathing. Could have gone worse. Almost did." The older man looked down, thumb rubbing the edge of his badge. "You could both swing for obstruction, or worse. Harboring, shooting, false claim of marriage." Calder met his eyes. "Then swing us both. But it won't make it right." Something in his tone, quiet, final, gave the man pause. He studied the dust at his boots, the faint trail of smoke twisting into the evening air. The woman standing behind him like the ghost of every wrong ever done in this land. "Finally," he said, "you've had your reckoning here already. I think," he turned, pulling his reins. "County won't waste another rope on mercy that's already paid for." The younger deputy looked like he wanted to argue but didn't. They mounted up, and soon the sound of hooves faded down the valley road, swallowed by the wind. Calder watched until they disappeared. Then he turned to Eleanor. Her eyes were damp but steady. "What happens now?" she asked. He looked out toward the hills, the grass glinting silver under the lowering sun. "Now, we live." She gave a small, tired smile. "That all?" "That's enough," he said. The rest of the evening passed in the kind of silence that feels like an answer. Calder unsaddled his horse but didn't put away the tack. Some part of him still expected to ride, to keep moving like he always had. But when he saw her sitting on the porch, hands folded in her lap, eyes turned toward the horizon, he stopped. He joined her without a word. The old rocking chair creaked beneath his weight, keeping time with the wind. Beside him, Eleanor's shawl hung loose over her shoulders, the fabric worn thin but warm. They watched the valley together, the light fading slow, painting everything in gold and rust. The air smelled of wet earth and wild sage. A hawk circled high above, its cry long and lonely, carried over the plains. "You ever think it'd end like this?" she asked softly. "No," he said. "Didn't think it'd end at all." She glanced at him. "You still carry it, don't you?" "Whatever came before," he nodded. "Reckon I always will, but it don't carry me anymore." She considered that, then smiled faintly. "Then maybe we're both free." The porch settled into stillness. The last of the light gathered on the horizon like embers, fading into the long shadow of night. Calder leaned back, the chair groaning softly. He closed his eyes, listening, to the wind through the grass, the slow thrum of crickets, the steady creak beside him as she rocked. For a long time, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been lived. When darkness came full, he reached into his coat pocket and drew out something small, a locket, tarnished with age. He opened it once, quietly, then set it on the table between them. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman and 2 children, faces blurred by years. Eleanor looked at it, then at him. "Your family," he nodded. "Used to be. You keep them close. Closest I can." She touched the locket gently, then closed it. "Maybe that's enough too." He didn't answer, but the set of his shoulders softened. The moon rose slow over the ridge, casting silver light across the yard. The rosebush by the well gleamed faintly, one last blossom clinging to its stem. Eleanor watched it sway, then whispered, "It's still standing." Calder followed her gaze. "So are we." Somewhere far off, a church bell rang, faint, uncertain, as though the sound had traveled too far to remember what it was for. Neither flinched. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the rocking chair sighing beneath him. She reached out, not to take his hand but to rest her fingers lightly against his sleeve. The touch was small, but in it lived the weight of everything they'd endured, the rope, the storm, the blood, and the long silence after. When the wind rose again, it carried the scent of rain and roses, the promise of another season, another day not taken from them, and for the first time, they let the world move without fear. Two silhouettes against the firelit porch, not saints, not sinners but survivors, watching the horizon burn itself into morning.